I would like to introduce Liz Lipski. She is a Ph.D. in nutrition. She is the Director of Academic Development for Nutrition at Maryland University Integrative Health, and she is a best-selling author. We're going to be talking about navigating through the specialized diets. Welcome, Liz.
Hi, Kristin. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm so excited to have you. When I met you several years ago, I was just in awe of, I read some of your books, and I just felt like you got it, and you got it right. And not only did you get it, but you explained it in a way like a mom like me could understand. And so I am just so thrilled to have you on the summit. And I'm just so thrilled for all those families that might not yet know about you to be able to hear about, some of the experience and some of the tips and some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. So thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome.
So what is your interest in autism? Like, how did that even start?
I think it started with my stepson, who moved in with us when he was about 22 years old, and I had been told he was very stubborn. And within the first couple of weeks, I'm like, he's not stubborn. He's learning disabled somehow. And I didn't really know much about high-functioning autism. I certainly knew a fair amount about autism, but I didn't really know about people with high-functioning autism, and it became really apparent pretty quickly that he had a different way of learning and that nobody had ever really figured that out before. So it was fascinating to live with him, and somehow I started teaching also for the Autism Research Institute, and really loved being part of that community, and because there's so much help that's out there that the parents don't really know about, and how do we help get that information out there, which is what's exciting about the summit.
Absolutely. And now, what roles do you think nutrition plays with people that, have that diagnosis of autism? I know we're going to be talking about, mitochondrial functions and things like that. So, what role does nutrition play in with the digestive and the yeast issues that we've heard about, and brain function and leaky gut, and the list goes on and on. So can you...
Whoa, that's a lot of questions.
I just know there's so many words that people are hearing about, and it's so confusing because when we first have our babies, no one even talks to us. But, let's start with mitochondrial function. Like, what does that even mean?
Okay, so that one's an easy one. I know the answer to that. So basically, the mitochondria are the little energy factories that live inside of your cells, and they are symbiotes that came, I don't know how many millions of years ago, and they were really bacteria when they first developed, and they found a really warm, cozy place to live inside of us, and now they make energy for us, and we can't live without them, and they can't live without us. So it's a really good partnership. And I think what's interesting is that we hear so much about kids on the spectrum and adults on the spectrum, how they have poor mitochondrial function. And but the interesting thing to know about the mitochondria is that in order for them to work right, they actually need a whole bunch of nutrients. They need B vitamins and coenzyme Q10, and they need manganese and molybdenum and zinc. And so a lot of our kids are really picky eaters. And so it's hard to get a lot of these nutrient-dense foods in them, because so often what the kids really want is macaroni and cheese and pizza, and as long as it's white bread and flour and cheese, they're pretty happy. So our kids don't always get all of the nutrients that they need, and that's really one of the reasons why nutrition is so critically important, because they're not going to have good brain function, good energy function, or things that feel balanced if their diet's not right.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of the families that are listening, when you said they only want mac and cheese, there's so many foods that they go after, and I know we're going to be talking about that later on, but, for those little red flags as parents are listening, there are foods that our kids are going after that they really should not be eating, and I think that's a great example of one. Now, we're talking about also digestive issues and malnourishment. So many of our children, they're not digesting the foods that we're giving them, whether it even be a food that is, maybe something that they can eat. They're still not digesting it. And even with my own son, he had failure to thrive for almost 4 years. And, we had him on all these different specialized diets, and, we were doing enzymes, and there was just so much going on in that kiddo's body. How can we help? What do we tell these families out there that are dealing with that?
Well, first of all, my heart goes out to everyone because you love your children and they take so much work. All kids take a lot of work, but a special needs child takes so much more work. And no matter how much we love our kids, they are disruptive, even if they're neurotypical.
Yeah.
So anyway, so my heart goes out because I know how time-consuming all of this is, and I also know that some parents go. I met a man at one of the first autism conferences that I went to, and he has 4 kids who have diagnosis of autism, and they all have different kind of diagnoses. And we always say if you've met one kid with autism, you've met one kid with autism. And he had a family like that. And so how do you even figure out what to feed everybody when everybody needs something that's different? So it's not an easy proposition, but we do know, and the research is kind of all over the map on digestive problems and absorption problems in people who are on the spectrum. But at least one research study indicates that about 60%, almost 2 in 3 people who are on the spectrum don't have enough enzymes to be able to actually digest their food properly. And we see this when there's inflammation in the lining of the small intestine. So and we also see this when children and adults with autism don't have enough hydrochloric acid. So I guess let me just kind of start from the beginning a little bit in that when we chew the food, first we have to get it in our mouth, right? And then we chew the food, and as it goes down, it hits the stomach, and in the stomach there should be a lot of hydrochloric acid. And the hydrochloric acid has a few different jobs, and what it does is it would burn you if you spilled it on you. It's really acid. Yet, in the human body, in the stomach, there's a lot of mucus in there, and what it's used for is starting to break apart protein that's in food so that we can start digesting that protein, because when we first eat it, it's in big chunks. And depending on how well we've chewed it, it's in even bigger chunks. And so the body has to start breaking that down. So the hydrochloric acid is the first part of digestion where the body's trying to use the protein and break it down. And in a lot of our kids, because it takes a huge amount of energy to make that hydrochloric acid, a lot of our kids don't have enough of it. And I'm not suggesting we give our children hydrochloric acid, but giving them diluted vinegar or umeboshi plums, which are these kind of salty, very, very salty Japanese plums, or giving them something like Swedish bitters, can really help kind of stimulate their stomach acid and stimulate their digestion. So like in Chinese terms, it would be like stoking the agni or the fire that's in the stomach, because we really need the stomach to be working really great in order to be able to digest that protein. Then what happens is when the food leaves the stomach and it's kind of in this kind of gooey mass, looks like it just went through a blender and it has all this acid in it, then a couple other things happen. One is it goes into the first part of the small intestine, and in that part of the small intestine, what happens is that acid is used to start absorbing minerals. So you said your son had failure to thrive. So if he couldn't break down the protein and he couldn't absorb the minerals because his stomach acid was low, then he wasn't able to actually get the nutrients. Then there's a third piece that happens in our kids, and that's that the pancreas at the same time secretes digestive enzymes and also secretes basically like baking soda. And it neutralizes that acid so that we don't have that acid further down. What happens is that then the food keeps traveling down, and if you could imagine what the small intestine looks like, it really looks like a towel. It has like thousands and thousands of teeny little loops, and we call those villi. And then on all those little loops, if you took a magnifying glass, you could see little tiny threads coming off of them. And those little tiny threads, they actually look like a brush, almost like a toothbrush. And it's on those absorptive surfaces that we actually absorb food from our digestive system that goes into the bloodstream, and then we can utilize it. What happens is that if we have yeast overgrowth, which so many of our kids do, if we have yeast overgrowth, or we have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or we have parasites, what happens is that, or if a child has, for example, gluten sensitivity or dairy sensitivity or intolerance, what happens is that we start actually getting a little bit of inflammation on these villi and these brush borders that are called microvilli. And what's also on the very tips of those is a hormone that gets sent right back to the pancreas and said, I just ate all this food, secrete all these enzymes so that I can digest the food. So if the villi and the microvilli, those little brush borders, have too much mucus on them, if they're inflamed, if they're denatured or damaged in any way, the pancreas doesn't even get the message to release the enzymes, and so our kids can't digest the food. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because, most of us as parents, clearly I've been working with my son for over 11 years, so I understand it now. But back then, after he first got his diagnosis, I didn't know any of this. I didn't understand any of this. This wasn't something that you learned, at least I didn't learn in high school and or college. And so, I think it's so important for these families that are listening right now, wherever their child's at, doesn't matter if they're 10 or 5 or 15 or 32 even, the fact that we can always learn and then figure out ways to help heal that gut, because when you're talking about yeast overgrowth and things in that nature, there are treatments and protocols that, not just diet, but there are things that we can do to help that child at any age, correct?
Absolutely. And one of the things I love is at the Autism Research Institute, and maybe some of the other organizations too, they collect parent ratings. And the parents send in information. They say, this is what helped my child. These are the things that really have helped, whether it's behavioral therapy or whether it's food or it's supplements or it's medications like naltrexone or whatever it is. And the parents really respond. And every time it's done, the main pieces that parents say, these are the things that have helped the most, are actually treating kids for yeast overgrowth and changing their children's diets.
Wow. And I think parents that are listening right now, especially if you're on the fence or you think, oh gosh, my typical doctor, my general doctor said, diet is hogwash, I would really recommend at least reading more about what Liz is talking about, and also just Googling what a lot of the parents are talking about, because diet does play such a huge role, my son included, and I think that it's so sad when families out there are told not to even try it, especially when we've seen so many children do so much better, and that brings me to the next question. When we're looking at brain function, what are some of the signs and symptoms that we might be seeing when a child, isn't able to digest their food the way you're talking about, and how does nutrition really play a role with that?
Well, first of all, if you think about our lungs, they eat oxygen, right? And you think about how long can we live without our lungs? And then you think, okay, well, how long can we live without water? Because our body's two-thirds water. But what's your muscle made of? What are your bones made of? What are all your tissues made of? They're made of the food that we eat. So if your kids can't actually take in the nourishment from the food that they eat, nothing's going to work right, including the brain, which takes 25% of the glucose that we eat. It takes a huge amount of energy to keep the brain focused. So, if you can't get the nutrients, everything's going to suffer. And we see this in brain function, behavior. We see this also in hugely in GI issues. So, a lot of our kids have recurring abdominal pain. They have irritable bowel syndrome. They're constipated. They have diarrhea. They're incontinent. I remember working with a little girl who was 7, and she wasn't diagnosed with autism. She was diagnosed with pervasive developmental delay. And she was mainstreamed in school, and she had siblings, and they were all neurotypical. And she was 7, and she was incontinent. She would pee in her pants and she would poo in her pants every single day. And she was wearing pull-ups, and this was really awkward for her because she was old enough to know better. And that was her concern. Her mom's biggest concern was that she was just a behavioral nightmare. She would throw tantrums, and she would, at school, just take her hand and sweep things off of people's desks onto the floor. And she just wasn't in good behavior. And when they came to see me, I really wanted to do a lot more with them, but where we started was with what I call an elimination diet. And the elimination diet looks like this. You can eat fruit, you can eat vegetables, you can eat fish and poultry and lamb and bison, and you can eat non-gluten containing grains like rice and millet and buckwheat and seeds that are grain-like amaranth and quinoa. And you can make this food any way you'd like. And you could even use maybe some nuts and seeds and maybe some almond flour or pecan flour to make some things. But what it doesn't have in it is milk or eggs or gluten-containing grains, which is wheat and rye and oats and spelt and camus. It doesn't have, wheat noodles, but you could have rice noodles. And it doesn't have any artificial flavors or sugars or colors. And anyway, so they started this diet, and within a week, she was no longer having peeing or pooing in her pants. No more incontinence. Wow. And within 2 weeks, the teacher at school was saying, boy, she's behaving so much better. And they hadn't said anything about what they were doing. And everybody at home noticed that she was behaving so much better. And so the beauty of thinking about nutrition first is that it's without good digestion and absorption and without kind of the right diet for your child or children, which can be different for different people, but without the right one, we're not really giving them the right chance to kind of kind of develop properly and feel properly. Dr. Ari Vojani has done work where he's looked at children who have severe reactions to gluten-containing grains and dairy products. And so a lot of parents on the call have probably tried a gluten and casein-free diet with some good results, maybe some better results than others. I don't think it's the whole answer. But interestingly, when he actually did a research study and looked at kids who were on the spectrum, and he measured them for antibodies against gluten, and then he also tested them for anti-brain antibodies against gluten. About over 40% of the kids actually had these antibodies against gluten and also in their brain against gluten. And there's this thing called, in some people, dairy products become casomorphins, and grain products can become glutamorphins. So it's as if our kids are smoking opium because it's like they're drugged out on morphine.
Wow.
Now, I've never smoked opium, but you know, from all those movies and everything, it's like, what are people doing? They're withdrawn. They're not social. They're lost in their own little world. Doesn't that feel the same?
I imagine so. I mean, I remember with my own son when we did just taking him off gluten and dairy, and then later we tried some other diets, which we're going to get into in a moment here, I want to ask you about. But we noticed, especially when we moved over to the specific carbohydrate diet, which I know you're going to be talking about, but he looked like a child going off drugs. That's what it reminded me of, because exactly what you're saying. He was scaling the walls. Mind you, he was only 2.5 years of age, but he was scaling the walls. He was biting, and he had never done that before. He either didn't want to sleep or he wanted to sleep. He didn't want to eat any new foods. He would look for any crumbs anywhere. I had to get rid of everything in the house, and I actually found him. He had crawled out of his crib and at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'd found him by the refrigerator, and he was trying to get a breadcrumb. I don't even know how he knew it was there. And so I can totally imagine what you're talking about, because that's what it looked like if he would have been 22 and in one of those documentaries, you know, and you took the sound off doing that, he would have looked like, you know, somebody going off drugs. And it lasted for us about 10 days. And, you know, for the families out there, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It was not a fun 10 days, but I did know that food had to play a role, because we were on waiting lists for 6+ months just to get into these doctors that were specialized, and I had read online about diet. And so I thought, well, that's something I could try. And we went from the gluten-free, dairy-free diet, and then I'd heard a couple weeks later about the SCD diet, and I thought, well, let me try that, because I felt like maybe we weren't getting enough results with the other. And wow, it was literally life-changing. You know, clearly it didn't make him recovered right away, and it wasn't like this magic bullet, but it definitely was the steps that led to the fogginess to go away, and a lot of the behaviors to change, and a lot of his focus to return, and really the therapies then that we were doing could really play more of a significant role, because prior to that, the child, man, all he wanted was chicken nuggets, pizza, waffles, crackers, gallons of milk, cookies, and you know, you name it. And when I say that to families when I'm out there talking that are especially newly diagnosed, they always tell me, oh my gosh, Kristin, the little hairs on the back of my neck just went up. How did you know what my child's eating? And I said, I just feel like it doesn't matter if you're in Kansas or if you're in London, our kids for some reason go after the same things. And that to me is a huge red flag. And so absolutely I can understand what you're talking about. I hope the parents out there can, you know, hopefully we painted a good picture for them so they can maybe see what to look for. And now that makes me want to talk about, you know, the gluten-free. We've all heard, a lot of us have heard of the gluten-free, casein-free diet, or the gluten-free, dairy-free diet. You know, can you talk a little bit about that and what that kind of looks like?
I can. So, you know, so each of these diets is, what can I say? I don't know if you've ever met Daniel Hawthorne. He's a man who is high-functioning autism, and he didn't speak until he was maybe 5 or 6 years old. Did you ever meet him at a meeting?
I've never met him, no.
Oh, he's just amazing. I love him. Anyway, and he didn't speak, and his parents just thought he was mute. And his mom started cooking, making biscuits, making potatoes instead of biscuits. And he started talking in full sentences. And
wow.
And it was almost overnight. And so he's someone probably, and when he was an adult too, he heard about, on all the different forums for parents, he said, well, I should probably try this gluten casein-free thing. He said, but, it sounds like too much. I'll just start with the gluten. And within 24 hours, he was starting to feel better. Now, he's somebody who actually probably has celiac disease, and he was just never diagnosed with it. So, this diet isn't going to help everybody, but for some people, it will be a miracle. And as you say, Kristin, it's hard because our kids, these are the foods that they love, but they're addicted to these foods. And like any other addict, you're thinking, oh my gosh, what are they going to eat? My child is starved. And the truth is that your son eventually started eating other food, right? Because he got hungry.
Yep, it took, little by little. He did a little bit of something every day, but eventually he got hungry, and by day 10, he was eating what I was putting in front of him. And and I'll be honest, for the parents listening, I was nervous. I thought, oh my gosh, what if he passes out, or what if this, or what if that? I did make sure to get liquids, because that was one thing that that he was accepting was liquids. So I wanted to make sure just keep him hydrated, and I think that's important for parents to know. But I knew that he'd eventually eat, because I knew he didn't have a swallowing issue. I knew it wasn't something to do with the mechanics of his chewing. I knew it was just his brain didn't want to eat the foods I was putting in front of him, because he clearly wanted the foods, like you said, that he was addicted to, and it was giving him that kind of high. And now suddenly he wasn't getting that high, and he was craving it. So, I think that for me, it was worth the 10 days, and everybody's different. Everybody's days are different. For us, it was 10 days, and again, it was not easy, but my goodness, was it worth it? Absolutely, 100%.
I'm so glad you persevered. It's, every time, I'm not in practice anymore, but when I was in practice and I would say this to parents, they would look at me like I was a lunatic, because this is what our kids love to eat. Yet, it's also, and I personally, I've never recommended just gluten and dairy-free. It's like, if we're going to do it, let's take out the sugar, let's take out the artificial colorings and the Pop-Tarts and the, gummy worms and everything else. Let's just clean the whole diet up. So I would recommend kind of an elimination diet. And there's Tom Maltaire and Ali Segerston have a wonderful book called The Elimination Diet, where people can find delicious recipes. And he's a colleague friend of mine who's a nutritionist, and it's a wonderful book. So that's something useful. And I also have a version of it that I can send to you, Kristin, and you can post somewhere. I'd be happy for you to do that. I actually made one specifically for parents of autistic kids, and it's up on my website.
Oh, wonderful.
At innovativehealing.com. If the people look in the autism section. So anyway, so I would do an elimination diet. Why? Because it's like starting with kind of a blank slate. It's starting from the beginning to see if food is really an issue for your child. Now, if your child also has a huge amount of GI problems, I probably wouldn't necessarily start there. But what it does do is it reduces inflammation. So if you think your child has a lot of brain inflammation, you might start there. And again, some people get really good results. What's your experience with kind of gluten casein-free or elimination diet in our community?
It feels like what I always recommend with families, especially if they're coming from the chicken nugget world and the pizza world and the cookies and crackers and gallons of milk world, which is a lot of them. I know in the beginning, like a long time ago when I first started talking about diet, I think I probably scared a lot of people because I was so gung-ho of like, no, you have to take this away, that away, this way. And, and I think it was just too much for a lot of people to really, no pun intended, but digest. And so now what I recommend is to start with baby steps of, look at the gluten-free, dairy-free at least, and if you have to just start gluten-free in the beginning and then you work your way up to gluten-free, dairy-free, and then once you're understanding that, and then you might say, well, gosh, corn, I know with my son is something that he cannot have, and you might say, oh, maybe I don't want to give corn, and the sugars, that's also a really big thing, especially if you think you have yeast issues, that's really big. And so, we try to take it in baby steps because what we started getting feedback from a lot of the families, especially the newer families, is that if it was too overwhelming, they were almost going to do nothing. And
right.
So if we can at least start them where, okay, hey, here's some easy steps. And then what happens is then they get kind of comfortable and they go, oh, this isn't that hard. And then they can start looking at some of the other diets out there. I know with my son, we started gluten-free, dairy-free, and then went on to the SCD diet, and then we went on to body ecology diet. And now, it's been years and years that we've been doing this. This wasn't something that we've just started. I mean, my son has been on a very specialized, tailored diet for him going on 11 years. And so now that he's getting older, now we're trying to introduce foods to him to see if he can handle it with the basis, the bare minimum being gluten-free, dairy-free, corn-free, and very much reduced in any sugars. But now we have, sugars like monk fruit and stevia and things that, don't feed the yeast. So I feel happy that there's a lot of alternatives out there. But because he's getting older and his diet's, his gut's doing much better, it's not one of those things where it's a one-size-fits-all and you have to stay at this diet or you need to stay there. I think that's why this talk is so important because just really navigating through all these different diets, and it isn't something that you learn overnight. It is something that I still learn, and I've been doing this for a decade with my son. And so, but again, also not being so afraid to try new diets. That's the other thing we found in the community is if they are on a gluten-free, dairy-free diet, they are now so comfortable, then they get nervous to want to change to something else, even though maybe the gluten-free, dairy-free diet is not, the end-all, be-all for their child. They're afraid to learn new recipes. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, it's and everybody does it differently, but if a parent is willing to, and if they have the bandwidth to do it, I say, let's do the whole thing. Let's just jump right in and try to give them support. And there's so much better support out there now than there ever was. There are so many nutritionists and nutrition coaches who really kind of understand these diets and can take you grocery shopping. And there's so many good cookbooks out there that it's way less hard than it used to be to do all these. Dana Lake and Kelly Dorfman and Pam Compart all have wonderful cookbooks, and so it's Julie Matthews. I mean, there's so many good resources out there that weren't there even 10 years ago when you started all of this.
So, yeah, there was one cookbook when I started,
yeah,
for the most part.
Yeah.
It's definitely different and so much nicer than it used to be.
So much nicer. And there's so many kind of foods that are kind of gluten-friendly and kind of even look like what your kids are used to. So I figure I only have one shot at it. If people don't see a big change in their child, then they might get discouraged. And I know that gluten and casein-free might not do it all by themselves. So, and again, if I thought if I was working with somebody and I thought they really had a lot of GI issues, yeast overgrowth, I would definitely go to one of the low carbohydrate diets. And you've mentioned a couple of them. So one is the specific carbohydrate diet. And right now we have a little bit of research on it. It was used at the Johnson Center in one research study that has not yet been published, so I don't really have all of the data on it. They put these kids on the specific carbohydrate diet. They actually provided the food to the families, which made it way easier. And they were really looking for changes in GI issues in these kids. Were kids able to digest better? Were they able to utilize their food better? Did they have less diarrhea? And did they have less GI issues? And they did find that, but they also found that the kids' behavior changed as well. And so we also have good pediatric research studies. They're small, but they're really good on this diet in children who have ulcerative colitis that report that these kids, their guts heal and they don't really need medication. And that's something that's a pretty serious illness, but it works. And this diet's been around for, at least 30 years, maybe longer. So it's one that's been used a lot. And what it looks like is it's a grain-free diet. There's no grains on it at all. There's fruit. There's leafy vegetables. There's all kinds of animal proteins. Again, it's a whole foods diet, so there's no refined food on it. And one of the there's a lot of eggs in this diet, so if you know that your child doesn't do well with eggs, this probably isn't the right diet for you. And kids can also eat hard cheese, which for a lot of our kids, and I'm sure you, Kristin, that was a really good piece of it because at least your kids could have some cheese, which our kids crave as well. So, and one of the other things that's allowed on it is nuts and honey. And so there are a lot of really wonderful recipes that you can make with using almond flour or pecan flour or coconut flour and honey. So there's still a lot of sweets on this diet, and kids really like that. And so for a lot of people, and again, the Autism Research Institute, it was more than 2/3 of children who benefited greatly from this diet. So it's definitely one to look at. And then, Kristin, you were talking about the body ecology diet, which is Donna Gates' diet. And she's got a wonderful book and website and materials that make it easier to do. It's not the easiest of diets because she's really asking you to culture and ferment foods. She's asking you to do a huge amount of cooking at home, and as many of these diets are. And yet people feel pretty good on it. And so that's another way to go. Then Natasha McCammell-McBride also has the gut and psychology syndrome diet, and she developed it because her son was autistic, and it looks a lot like the specific carbohydrate diet. It also looks a lot like the Donna Gates body ecology diet. There's a lot of similarities in all of them. It's also a grain-free diet. There's no grains at all on it. There's a lot of eggs. There's a lot of home-cooked meals. And I've even heard her talk about, wouldn't it be just great to go out in the backyard and get the eggs from your own chicken and raise your own chickens? And, I think a lot of parents in this community, they really don't have time for this. So it's another wonderful kind of way. We don't have research on it yet, but it's another, it's not one size fits all. And I guess that's what I'm trying to make sure that you get. It's like trying to figure out what's the right diet for your child is what's the most important thing. And I love what you said, because what worked for your son at 2 is different 11 years later.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's not that one size fits all. It's a tailor-made program,
It is. But if I look at the way that I eat, I don't eat exactly the same way that I ate 2 or 3 years ago either. I was very influenced by a physician named Terry Wahls, Wahls, and her website's terrywalls.com. because she had unremitting, unrelenting multiple sclerosis, and she was in a wheelchair from it. And she was doing everything. She's an MD, and she was doing all the regular medical things, and she was just getting worse. And she had small children, and she said, I wonder if I could do something with my diet. And, it didn't take very long until she was actually out of her wheelchair and walking with a cane in less than a month. And 2 months later, she was riding her bicycle around the block. And, and basically she did a grain-free diet that had so many vegetables, because the vegetables are the thing that really reduce inflammation more than anything else, and also feed the gut microbiome and keep it healthy. And so it was very interesting. So she inspired me so much that over the last several years, 4 or 5 years, I can't tell you how many more vegetables I eat, but I'm like a vegeaholic, So I always ate a lot of them. So even when we look at our own diets, they're not the same as they were when we were in our 20s or in our teens or when we were kids. They change all the way through our life.
Absolutely. Now, we've heard a lot about paleo diet, and it seems like, there's different fads that come about, right? And I think paleo seems to be one of those diets that everyone's talking about right now. Can you maybe shed a little bit of light on that diet?
I can. So a paleo diet is not that different from really the gut and psychology syndrome diet, which is also called the GAPS diet. It's basically a grain-free diet. It has a lot of root vegetables, which give good food for the probiotic bacteria that live in our gut, and there's a lot of leafy vegetables. And the whole idea is, what did cavemen eat before we had all this other kind of food that was around? And so again, it's another whole foods diet where you cook your own food, you eat a lot of meat, you eat a lot of fat. And we do know that a paleo diet, or even a ketogenic diet, which is like a Paleolithic diet on speed, that all of these diets, what they do, first of all, a whole foods diet, even if it's none of these other things, is going to improve your children's health, because it improves all of our health. Even if all you do is take sugar out of your child's diet, that might be a huge pivotal piece. So, but the paleo diet is, it's been around for maybe 20 years. It's grown a lot in popularity. And again, it's a lower carbohydrate, higher fat diet. And what's interesting about the brain is that the brain is made almost entirely of fat. And so there's such a beautiful logic in kind of, we need the proteins for making muscle and for growing and thriving. We need the good quality fats for our brain and for neurological development and for reproduction. And so, again, it's a relatively, the carbohydrates that are in a Paleolithic diet, there's relatively fewer of them. And what you're going to hear over and over in these dietary plans is control the carbohydrates, control the type of carbohydrates, because most of our kids have an imbalance in their gut microbiome. And what you want to do is feed their bugs right so that their brain will work right.
Absolutely. And I know that even those kids that might have seizure issues, I know a lot of times you hear in the biomedical community, they recommend the lower carb diets because they're seeing, success with that. The one thing I do want to mention, though, because I have done a lot of these diets with my son, when you are taking away and eliminating the majority of those carbs, you need to make sure that you feed them more snacks, maybe every couple hours or something, because they will start getting a headache. At least my son did, and I used to do every diet with him so I could kind of maybe experience, if there was, everyone's different, but if I could experience something that maybe he couldn't tell me, or have a little bit of a, clue to maybe what he might have been going through. If you are used to eating carbs and you take away carbs, you start getting pretty hungry for carbs. And so it's important to, in some of these diets, you eat a lot of nuts and different vegetables and fruits and things like that. It's important to kind of recognize if they do start getting hungry, because I know my son used to get a little bit irritable when we were switching different things, and even myself, I would get a little irritable, and so I might grab some almonds or something to that nature, and then feel better. Have you noticed any of that with any of the people you've ever worked with or talked with?
I have, and also I've also noticed just the opposite, that some people get way more energy and they feel amazingly better almost right away.
Oh, I wish I was one of those.
Yeah, so you can really see a lot, you can see a lot of variability. The other thing that happens on a lower carbohydrate diet is a lot of us will get constipated from it.
Mm-hmm.
And you said something else that's so important, is that you did these diets along with your son. And one of the most fascinating things is I remember I was working with a family, and I said, the best way to do this is for the whole family to do it. And if there's older kids, you basically say, look, we're all going to do a science experiment. We're all going to do it together. And we're just going to do it for 2 weeks, and we're going to see how we feel. And it's not necessarily that you're only going to do the diet for 2 weeks, but typically, if you're on the right diet, in 2 weeks, you're going to start seeing really pretty remarkable changes. And that's going to encourage you to keep doing it, which isn't meaning that you're going to heal everything. But the fascinating thing is that if the whole family can go on one of these diets together, it's surprising. Sometimes it's the mom or the dad or one of the other siblings that actually gets the best result. Because, our kids are still our kids, and they're part of our family, and some of the same kind of genetic predispositions run through families, and some of the same food sensitivities run through families. And so it's really interesting to see sometimes that other people in the family also get really remarkable shifts in how they feel.
I've heard that many times from many people, and I think my son, watching me eat the same foods he was eating, also, created motivation for him. Do you have any other tips for motivating families when they're, because it is hard to try to change the way we eat? What other tips can you offer them?
Well, first of all, kids are picky about food, and our kids are really picky about food. Way more picky than an average child. Even average kids, neurotypical kids, you might have to give them Brussels sprouts or bananas or whatever it is. You might have to put that food on their plate, 15 or 20 times before they're willing to eat it. And so with our kids, it might take even longer. So it's just, and our kids also are very sensitive to texture. They're sensitive to color. Sometimes they don't want their foods to touch each other. And that's not just kids on the spectrum, but it's why they sell so many plates that have 3 parts to them for kids. It's like kids want things separately. So, if your child likes things that crunch, then raw vegetables and crunchy fruits like an Asian pear might be really good things to present. Or making kind of gluten-free crackers of some sort, or frying plantains, or making home fries that are crispy. If your child really doesn't like that texture, but they like more pudding-like textures, then puree food. Because a pureed food, throw your food in a blender or use a hand blender. So there's so much about kind of trying to figure out how your child likes it best, and trying to make the food that way, so that your child gets a broader variety of food. Because really, for all of us, excuse me. for all of us, one of the most important things is getting a large variety of what we eat, which helps feed the gut microbes and also gives us a variety of different nutrients.
Absolutely, and I know even with my son, because we didn't do a lot of sugars, we actually did no sugars whatsoever. He never even got exposed to any type of sugar other than if it was in a fruit or, naturally in the food. And until last year, and the only reason I did that was because I wanted to experiment adding in a little bit here and a little bit there to kind of see how he would do with that, because I also realized, I've been cooking for him mostly all of his foods. I would say 99.999% of his foods the last 11 plus years have all been home cooked, not in restaurants. And I thought, well, he's going to get older one day, and I'm not always going to be there to cook all of his food for him. And so, and he needs to learn how to eventually make it the right choices. And so I started, experimenting different things and adding certain things, always having that base gluten-free, dairy-free. He does have celiac as well, so he does need to remain gluten-free. But it's interesting. He still doesn't really go for anything that's too sweet. He has a couple of things every now and then he really likes. But the other day when I asked him, what do you want for dinner? And he can choose, different menu selections that I give him. He was very clear he wanted chicken and quinoa and green beans, that day. And I thought, I wonder what other 13-year-old, he's going to be 14 in April, but I wonder what other 13-year-old, is asking for quinoa, green beans and chicken. And that's, for him, that was, that's his palate, though. He likes that particular food. But today, there are so many great options for alternative things with coconut oils and versus using butter and some of these grains, if your child can have grains, are really good for them. And so I think that if you are discouraged and you're listening right now, to realize that it's not something that's going to change overnight. It's not going to be something that's going to be super easy, but it's just like anything. It's kind of like for me especially, I don't particularly like to go to the gym, but once I get into the routine of going to the gym, I don't mind it, and then I actually look forward to it, and I'm like, I'm happy I did it. I think it's the same thing when you're trying to change all these different things. It's like at first you're maybe a little nervous and you don't know how to do it, and once you kind of get used to it, and then you start seeing your child feel better. To me, that's the biggest motivation. And then, I start thinking, gosh, how healthy is he compared to all of the other kids that are maybe don't have autism that are typical? I watch what some of these kids eat, and I go, oh my gosh, my son has never had a soda pop in his whole entire life. And people look at me and go, what do you mean he's never had a Coke or whatever it is? And I'm like, first of all, he's not missing out on anything, number one. But number two, I'm like, no, he got diagnosed at 2 years, 4 months, and I wouldn't have given a 3-year-old a Coke beverage. So I said, of course he's never had, anything like that. And so I think that our kids are really here to teach us a better way to live. And that's what I love when you say the whole family should do it, because really our kids are, I feel like, our best teachers. Has that been your experience with any of the families you worked with?
Our kids are always our best teachers. Always, always. They teach us how to be patient. They teach us how to love unconditionally. Over and over. None of us were taught to cook. None of us were taught to cook in this way. But what I realize is that 200 years ago, everyone was eating organically grown, homemade foods all the time. And the foods that we're eating are really new to nature. They're, as Michael Pollan calls them, they're food-like. But a lot of them aren't really food anymore, like soft drinks. They're not food. They're chemical soups, and they have no place. Anyway, there's nothing redeeming about them, in my opinion. And that goes for a lot of what we consider to be food. But really what we're trying to bring our kids back to is a type of diet that is so historically ingrained. They're not new to nature molecules. These are molecules that people have eaten for millennium and that the body can recognize. And we have a whole new field that we call epigenetics, nutritional genomics, metabolomics. And what researchers have discovered is that we have kind of the human genes, And the genes are kind of like the computer that we were born with. We're given a computer at birth. But only 1.5% of the genes are actually coding for proteins. The other 98.5% are actually saying, this is the kind of cell I want you to be, and this is how I want you to behave. And that's our epigenome, and it's like the software that we put on our computer. So our body is always reacting to its environment in relation to our genetics. And so in our community, in the autistic community, our kids are reacting the best that they can to the environment that they're in. And so if we can change their environment, maybe their genes will start relaying different messages. Maybe they'll start transcribing differently. And that's really what we're looking for. And that's really kind of the most exciting piece. It's like every cell in your body and my body has exactly the same genetic code. But how does a cell know to become a skin cell or an ear or an eye or a lung, or, how does it know that? Well, it knows that because of all this epigenetic information that's in what we used to call the junk DNA, because we didn't really know what it did. Well, now we know it's all about how cells differentiate, and by changing your child's environment, you can really change their overall health and well-being, and how well they can communicate and talk and think, and how independent they're actually going to be as they grow up. And so this is something worth making a change for. And it's as you've been saying, it's certainly not easy, and it changes all the time. Yet it's such an interesting piece, because we can really make big changes in optimizing our children's potential. And I think that's what all of us as parents want for our kids, is how do we optimize their God-given talents, and they have many of those, and somehow how can we optimize their ability to actually thrive in this culture that's not easy for really anybody to thrive in that well.
Absolutely. And I know as mommies, that's part of our I think at least, our DNA is we want to nourish our children, and part of that's with food. And so I think as mommies, learn more about, I don't want to discredit daddies too, but I think for the most part, it's a lot of mommies doing a lot of the cooking, right? And, I think how wonderful it is that today we live in a day where there are so many cookbooks, a lot that you mentioned, and, and there's so many other moms before us that have kind of led the fight, and then kind of paved this walk for us to be able to take together. And then people like you. I can't believe our hour is almost up, because I feel like I could talk to you forever. I love it. So now, before, I want to make sure we get a couple other questions in. For the parents out there, and I know there's a lot of them that say, okay, this all sounds great, but my kid is the pickiest eater in the world, and they live on pizza and pasta and cereal and all this other stuff. What, quick advice do you have for them?
Welcome to the club. Your child is just like all the rest of the kids, because that's what they all eat. That's what your son ate, right?
Yep, absolutely.
That's what they love. I'm not sure exactly why, but I think that really because they're the most addictive foods. So for a picky eater, you may want to work with an occupational therapist who works with kids who are picky eaters. What they'll do is something that you can actually do, which is to keep offering your child the same food over and over and over again. And they also do some tricks. And some of the tricks look like this. They'll say, okay, you don't have to eat it. I just want you to put it on a fork. I just want you to put it on your fork. Then if they do that, then they can get a reward of 5 minutes of playing a video game, or playing a game with you, or doing something that they love. And then the next time you say, okay, so, it might not be the next time. You might do the fork thing several times, but then you start going, oh, well, okay, you don't have to take a bite. I just want you to bring it up to your lips. Just bring it up there. You don't have to touch. And then you keep kind of working this. So pretty soon they're willing to touch it to their lips. Pretty soon they're willing to put it in their mouth, but they don't have to actually chew it. Then eventually you ask them to chew it. And you just kind of keep working with it. I remember one time a mom came to my office and she said, my son is so picky. And I just went into my cabinets and I said, well, I have some new foods for you. Why don't we try these? And I said, my kids really love them and they're delicious, you know? And he left my office a couple hours later and he had about 4 new foods.
Oh, wow.
And we just tried them, and they were, you know, things like pine nuts and, you know, things that had a texture that he would like. I had some rice thins, which I love. They're probably not that healthy, but you know, it's kind of one of my junk foods that I like to eat. Is I like to eat these corn thins that are like really skinny rice cakes, but they're made from corn, and they taste like popcorn. And so for kids who do okay on corn, it's another food. And so, you know, just kind of being creative about kind of how, you know, bringing home new things, trying. And then key, as you've said, is, boy, you got to get them unaddicted first, because while they're addicted, that's all they're going to want to eat.
Yeah,
and as you said, it's not pretty. You know, so it's not pretty, and parents are worried that their kids are going to starve, and your child won't starve because eventually they will get hungry and they will eat, but in the meantime, it's not fun.
It's not fun, but it's not forever, and I think people need to know that too. It's you get through it just like anything else, you know. And then at the end, when you get to the end of that tunnel, you're like, oh my gosh, we did it. And I think, you know, you've given so many great tips, and I think also really explained a lot of these diets. And again, it's not one of those things you say, okay, you know, this is the first diet, and then this is the second diet, and this is the third diet. I think you have to know your child probably better than anyone else, and you have to say, you know, what do I think I can try, and what do I think that my child might be addicted to? I think also writing a food journal and then writing behaviors down is probably also important. But, I mean, I wish we had 2 hours because I think we could go on and on. But clearly I'm very passionate about diets as well.
Well, you've seen that they work, you know, and
absolutely.
That's what the other parents need to hear is that you've actually seen that this is one of the things that's helped your son the most. And I would say that in this community, this is what parents are going to tell you over and over, that this is, you know, if we are primarily what we eat and what our brains can use. And so it's just critically important that this is an exploration. And, you know, I love what you said, that you know your child best. Yeah, there's nobody who's ever going to know your child the way that you do. And so fighting for your child and experimenting, and it really helps.
I think that this has just been so, like I said, helpful, and I know people want to learn more about you. And first of all, I know you've written books. Can you talk a little bit about that and where they can find your books, and then also where they can find out more about you?
So you can find my books, most of my books on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or local bookstore can order them for you. My biggest book is called Digestive Wellness, and then I also have Digestive Wellness for Children, which is actually 10 years old now. So There's still a lot of really amazing information in there that people can use. It's also getting a little old, but it's still pretty basic, and people can use that. And then a couple years ago, Rodale Press, about a year or so ago, took Digestive Wellness and put it into a hardcover, and that one's a little bit less available. But also on my website at innovativehealing.com, I do have an elimination diet that I put together for a company several years ago, especially for the autism community. So if you go to innovativehealing.com, you can download that for free. And I also, if you're a parent who just loves nutrition and has found that it has made all the difference in the world and you'd like to get a master's degree or a doctoral degree in nutrition, take a look at the website from my university, which is muih.edu, Maryland University of Integrative Health. And that's most of the places you can find me.
Wonderful. And any last messages you want to leave parents with?
Yeah, I guess there's one last piece, and that's that because you do know your child better than anyone, because you love your child, because you are with your child every single day, what I can say is I know you're overwhelmed. I know you have already too much to do, but if you just keep having hope that there are keys out there that will unlock pieces of your child, and if you just keep being curious and keep kind of working at this relentlessly, you will find that there are things that will really help your child so much and more than you ever dreamed of. And I wish that there was some kind of magic way to say, for your child, do A, then B, then C, then D. We just don't have a magic way because all of our kids are so different. And but because you know them so well, I think, just start one place, see how far that takes you, and then try the next thing. Try to find a physician who works integratively, who doesn't think you're a kook, and see if you can find good guides and coaches who can help you along the way. It's so nice to have support when you're doing these things, and we don't always find the support that we in the places where we expect to find it, but it's out there for you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to help our community and just for everything you've done. I greatly, greatly appreciate it.
It's such an honor. Thanks for asking me. You deserve so much for what you're doing for our community, too. You're bringing us together in a whole new way.
Oh, well, I'm lucky to be surrounded by people like you. Well, thank you guys for listening as well. And again, remember, there's always hope. Thanks, guys.